Good afternoon, buongiorno, buenos dias. The Vito Marcantonio Forum welcomes you to Community Mobilization and Cultural Pluralism in Working Class Neighborhoods, Leonard Covello. My name is Gil Fagiani, and I'm going to be your moderator today. First, I'd like to remind everyone to please shut off their cell phones and other electronic devices. The Vito Marcantonio Forum is a historical, cultural, and educational organization that brings together people from a wide variety of backgrounds interested in sharing knowledge of the life and work of Congressman Vito Marcantonio. A protege of Fiorello LaGuardia, Marcantonio was the most electorally successful radical American politician of the 20th century. He served as a congressman from East Harlem and the de facto congressman for Puerto Rico for 14 years, 1934 to 1936 and 1938 to 1950. Critical to his success was his unique multi-ethnic coalition of Italians, Puerto Ricans, and African Americans. Today's presentation marks the forum's 21st public event since it was reconstituted on October 11th, 2011. And this upcoming October 11th will mark our 5th anniversary. Activities the forum has sponsored include a special tribute, Vito Marcantonio and the Puerto Rican People, Solidarity in Progress, which was held on November 28th of 2012 and attended by 100 people at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. And then in August of 2014, we celebrated the 60th anniversary of Vito Marcantonio's death, and 50 people gathered at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx to celebrate his life. And to further honor his memory, Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz and New York City Council member and Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito attended and sponsored a proclamation naming August 9th as Vito Marcantonio Day in the Bronx. In celebration of Black History Month, the forum's author series at the Mulberry Street Library sponsored a talk on East Harlem's African American community by Chris Bell. Just going to give you a flavor of the things we've been doing. On September 19th, 2015, we celebrated Pope Francis's visit to East Harlem and Italian American Culture Month with a People's Pilgrimage to East Harlem, starting at Lucky Corner at 116th Street and Lexington Avenue at noon. The walk included Vito Marcantonio's home, and Our Lady of Angels Elementary School that Pope Francis visited, which was shut down to parishioners' protests in 2007. The Vito Marcantonio Forum is appealing to the Vatican to bless Marcantonio, who was refused a Catholic burial by Cardinal Spellman in 1954. On October 31st, 2015, we held a symposium at the Mulberry Street Library on Michael Parenti's memoir, Waiting for Yesterday, pages from a street kid's life that included a talk by Stephen Siciliano and readings by Lolo Pasquale and a dramatization by Roberto Ragone. And finally, this Wednesday, Marcella Beniceveni presented her book, Italian Immigrant Radical Culture, The Idealism of the Silver City in the United States, 1890 to 1940, along with the bilingual reading, Italian and English, of Arturo Giovanni's poetry by me, Maria Lasella, and Roberto Ragone. And this August, we will be sponsoring the 62nd anniversary of Vito Marcantonio's death at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. And later this year, at a time to be announced, we'll be holding a fundraiser. And those that are interested in getting involved with this or want to learn more about this, I encourage you to sign our sign-up sheet. So before we begin our program, I want to read my poem, Litany of San Vito, from my book of Blanquito en el Barrio, which is a tradition that we've been doing here, at the Vito Marcantonio Forum events. And anyone interested in one of these cards, I have extra copies. And also, our guest from Italy, Simone, will read it in Italian. So first I'm going to read it in English. Litany of San Vito for Congressman Vito Marcantonio, 1901 to 1954, or 1902, is it? 1954, yeah. San Vito of East Harlem, pray for us. San Vito, bread of the poor, pray for us. San Vito, crucified by Wall Street, pray for us. San Vito, martyr of McCarthyism, pray for us. From the jail cell wall, San Vito, deliver us. From the backyard crap game, San Vito, deliver us. From the loan shark's vig, San Vito, deliver us. From the drunken stupor, San Vito, deliver us. From TB and asthma, San Vito, protect us. From the social worker's visit, San Vito, protect us. From the immigration raids, San Vito, protect us. From the landlord's greed, San Vito, protect us. And this is the Italian translation that I did.
San Vito di East Harlem, prega per noi. San Vito, pane dei poveri, prega per noi. San Vito, crocifisso da Wall Street, prega per noi. San Vito, martire del maccartismo, prega per noi. Dalle pareti della prigione, San Vito, liberaci. Dal gioco d'azzardo nei cortili, San Vito, liberaci. Dal pizzo dello strozzino, San Vito, liberaci. Dall'ubriachezza molesta, San Vito, liberaci. Dalla tubercolosi e dall'asma, San Vito, proteggici. Dalla visita dell'assistente sociale, San Vito, proteggici. Dalla caccia agli immigrati, San Vito, proteggici. Dall'avarizia del padrone di casa, San Vito, proteggici.
I suggest, Anna, could you read in Spanish for us?
This is a reflection of Marcantonio's coalition.
This one. Ruega por nosotros, ruega por nosotros, ruega para nosotros, ruega por nosotros. San Vito, libéranos, San Vito, libéranos. San Vito, libéranos, San Vito, libéranos. Oh, this is the refrain. The refrain, okay. San Vito de East Harlem, San Vito, pan de los pobres. San Vito, crucificado por Wall Street. San Vito, mártir del marcatismo. De las paredes de la cárcel, del juego de dados en el patio, el prestamista sin escrúpulos, de la embriaguez del alcohol, de la tuberculosis y el asma, de la visita del trabajador social, de las redadas de migración, de la avaricia de los caseros. San Vito, protégenos, San Vito, protégenos, San Vito, protégenos, San Vito, protégenos.
Okay, so I'm going to begin our program with a brief overview of Leonard Covello's life. He was born in 1887 to a family of shoemakers in Avigliano Basilicata, one of the poorest regions of southern Italy. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1896 when he was 9 years old, joining his father in the East Harlem district of New York City, which was then America's largest Little Italy. His birth name was Leonard Covello, but a New York City elementary teacher changed his last name to Covello, much to the outrage of his father. Covello finished his elementary education at PS 83 and attended Morris High School in the Bronx. While in high school, he won a Pulitzer Scholarship, which enabled him to attend Columbia University. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 9/11 with a concentration in Romance languages. In 1913, he took a job teaching French and Spanish at DeWitt Clinton High School, where he realized that Italian-American school children had a conspicuously low graduation rate and comprised a high percentage of problem students. Through bilingualism and biculturalism, Covello saw the means to facilitate the transition of children from immigrants to integrated citizens without alienating them from their communities or native culture, while still instilling and preserving in them the pride of their Italian backgrounds. Already in 1914, he had founded Il Circolo Italiano, the Italian Circle, for this purpose. This club combined social service, recreational, and cultural activities. Vito Marcantonio was a member of Il Circolo Italiano. Covello served in World War II as a member of the Corps of Intelligence Police, conducting covert intelligence operations in Spain. In 1920, he returned to Dewood Clinton High School, where he began a campaign to establish Italian on an equal footing with other foreign languages taught in New York City schools. This led to his appointment as head of the newly established Italian department at Dewood Clinton in 1922, which he directed until 1926, when he was promoted to first assistant in modern languages, a position he held until 1934. In 1934, with the founding of Benjamin Franklin High School, East Harlem's first high school, Covello fulfilled his dream of creating a school organized around his theory of community-centered education in East Harlem. This concept, based on the recognition that the public school was the one social agency that touched nearly all families, called for interaction between the school and the family. Working through the school's Community Advisory Council, which consisted of teachers, students, parents, business, and civic leaders, an intensive program was launched to strengthen the East Harlem community and aid its development. From 1929 to 1942, he was adjunct professor at New York University, where he earned his PhD in education in 1944. As East Harlem became increasingly Puerto Rican in the 1940s, Covello fought in favor of racial integration. I'll repeat that. As East Harlem became increasingly Puerto Rican in the 1940s, Covello fought in favor of racial integration and applied the same principles he had in the 1920s and 30s with children of Italian immigrants. In 1956, Covello retired as principal of Benjamin Franklin High School and accepted an appointment as an educational consultant of the Puerto Rican Migration Division. He co-founded the American Italian Historical Association in 1966. By 1972, Leonard Covello returned to Italy at the invitation of Danilo Dolci, Italian social activist, educator, and poet, to apply his methods of education to disadvantaged children in Sicily. Covello died August 19, 1982 in Messina, Sicily, at the age of 95. In summary, Leonard Covello was a pioneer of cultural pluralism and community-centered education, and perhaps the leading Italian intellectual of the first half of the 20th century. And so I'm going to move on now to a reading from Leonard Covello's The Heart is the Teacher by Roberto Ragone, who has had over 25 years experience in New York State and local government and nonprofits, working in education, criminal justice, urban infrastructure, as well as arts and culture. He has worked as analyst, administrator, and advocate at Dewood Clinton High School, same as Covello, but in a different location, I believe.
Right.
The City Council, Mayor's Office, and State Senate. As a consultant, he now focuses on marketing, public relations, information technology, and strategic planning for businesses, nonprofits, and arts and related projects. And Roberto is co-chair of the Vito Marcantonio Forum.
Thank you. Should I stay here, Dave, or should I go?
No, go
Okay, great. So, actually, I think about that irony is that when Leonard Covello taught at Dewood Clinton High School, it was in this building, right? So it's historic in that sense. I taught at Dewood Clinton High School when it had moved to the Bronx years later. So I'm reading, we wanted to combine both scholarship and also a little bit of just humanizing him by reading from his autobiography. And I usually dramatize Vito Marcantonio, who I have seen on videotape. I've never seen Leonard Covello speak, so I'm just going to try to be, more than kind of a mechanical narrative voice, right? So, but this is the opening pages of his book, The Heart is the Teacher, where he's reflecting on the fact that it's his final days as a teacher. And it sort of transitions. He looks out the window, he sees the sun, and it's transitioning into him seeing the sun as a child in southern Italy, and I stop right there. 45 years of my life I spent as a teacher in the New York City public schools. 22 of these years I was principal at the Benjamin Franklin High School, located in the East Harlem district of Manhattan Island. In this long lifetime of teaching, I have learned much about the ways of immigrant peoples and their American-born children. I was an immigrant boy myself. I know what the American school can do to maintain family unity. I also know how the school can function as the integrating force in our democracy and in the molding of young citizens. After a half-century as a teacher and principal, I retired with the greatest regret. But I went right back to work with migrants. As educational consultant in New York City to the Migration Division of the Department of Labor at the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, I am trying to give the latest of our migrants, the Puerto Ricans, what I tried to give to the Italians and the Negroes, to the Irish and Germans, to the rest of the nationalities and races that make up that human mixture known as East Harlem. My time, my affection, and above all, my understanding. For only he who has suffered directly or indirectly the degrading insults of wop or nigger or spick or mick or kike, or whatever else the unwanted or newcomer in this land is called, can readily understand. I have known all these things. I have known the hunger for food and the much greater hunger for knowledge. I have known fighting and stealing in the life of the back alleys and the city pavements, and also the life of the spirit at the mission house and the helping hand of some truly magnificent men and women. I have known all of these things, and if I had to do it over again, it is hard to say what change, if any, I would make. From the window of my office at the Benjamin Franklin High School, I can see the East River Drive and the surging traffic of high-powered motor cars. It is Wednesday, the last Wednesday in August. For me, it is the last Wednesday in school. It is the end of my life as a teacher in a public school. It seems impossible. I cannot quite convince myself that it is or could be the end. I had walked into a New York City classroom 45 years ago. Life for me at that period stretched interminably into the future. I always felt that my life in a school would go on until my last day. I know that in September, the now empty classrooms and silent halls will fill once again. Feel the pulse of the life as the boys, my boys, pour into every nook and cranny of the school, of the building, and take it over as they have done so many, many Septembers. And I will not be there. It will seem strange not to stand again on the footsteps and watch them as they converge upon the school, greet them as they come up the steps, children of the great metropolis, Negroes whose parents migrated from the Deep South, Italians whose parents had forsaken the poverty-ridden villages of southern Italy, Puerto Ricans from that stricken island in the Caribbean, Irish, Jews, Germans, Finns, and Swedes, migrants from every corner of the world, from near and distant places, people on the move, uprooted people, disinherited, seeking a new and better way of life, fleeing from lands where oppression and exploitation had been their daily lot, in search of the land that would give them the status and dignity of free men. Once more, the exuberance of my boys will fill the corridors. Their energy and vitality will fairly burst the seams of this great building as they pour in. I see them, the fair-haired and the dark, in the colorful array of their clothing and pigmentation of their skin. How difficult it is to leave them. I get up from my desk beyond the East River, catching a brilliant reflection of sunlight. In this dazzling blur and in the pain within me, I see another land and another sun, and the first of all those leave takings, which are part of life, and at the same time, a bit of death. And then he transitions into his childhood. Very good.
Okay, next we have, next presenter is Professor Gerald Meyer. He's a founding member of the faculty at Hostos Community College, authored Vito Marcantonio, a radical politician, co-edited The Lost World of Italian-American Radicalism, and has published over 80 articles and reviews on a wide range of subjects. Professor Meyer serves on the editorial boards of Socialism and Democracy and Science and Society, appears in documentaries, reviews manuscripts for publication, and lectures widely. He is co-chair of the Vito Marcantonio Forum, and he will discuss today cultural pluralism versus Americanization.
Hi, I'm Jerry Meyer. Welcome to our panel today. There's been so many benefits for me, and I hope for other people, I'm sure it's true for other people, that when I started my work on Vito Marcantonio, which is in itself a wonderful topic, extraordinary topic, but one of the benefits of that was finding Leonard Covello. And Covello was Marcantonio's mentor. Marcantonio's father died when he was in high school in an accident, a motor car accident. He was run over by a motor car. There were lots more of those things years ago than we would imagine. The streets were packed with people and so on. And Marcantonio had one brother, apparently was schizophrenic, and kept in the house, and no one knew, only a handful of people knew he was actually there. And so now he's in high school. He's in DeWitt Clinton High School. And the original DeWitt Clinton High School was in the original building of John Jay that goes along 9th Avenue, and later was moved to the Bronx. And it was an all-boys school. And in any case, Marcantonio meets Covello here as a teacher, and Covello becomes his lifelong mentor and father figure. And Covello didn't have children, so it was an extraordinarily close relationship. They lived in side-by-side houses on 116th Street, and Covello was a pallbearer at Marcantonio's funeral. So a wonderful, wonderful relationship. And Marcantonio learns Italian from Covello. The Italians that arrived here, they spoke dialects, and Marcantonio was also from Basilicata, like Covello. And the largest Italian community in the United States was Italian Harlem. There was 90,000 Italians from 96th Street. They overflowed 96th Street, overflowed 125th Street. And it was the largest and the most Italian of all of the Little Italies in the United States. But within that Little Italy, and as other large Little Italies, there was sub-communities of people from the different regions, and even from the separate towns that lived together in a tenement or on a few blocks. And the area close to where Marcantonio was born was populated by Southern Italians, specifically from Aviano, actually, and Basilicata, that they reassembled themselves in the Little Italies and so on. But Covello predates Marcantonio by, I think, 12 years, I think, and but arrives when he's 9 into East Harlem. What's so remarkable about the biography, especially of Covello, is how typical it is, and yet there's some break that enables something big to happen, something that wasn't destined. The same is true for Marcantonio. There's something so typical, and then there's some break that enables him to emerge as a very big figure. But with Covello, it's so typically in the Italian migration is that the fathers arrived first. The men left the villages first, and to raise money. To raise money to bring the family to America, and also to set up a household. So they lived as lodges in other people's apartments while they were saving money for these purposes. And so Covello's father was here in America 5 years before the mother, and I think at that point 3 children, there were 4 others that would be born in America, arrive in Italian Harlem. There's a part here that's not clear, but they may have settled where Italian Protestants lived, which is interesting, and that becomes significant in, I think, Covello's story. but also that Covello comes from the background of artigiani, of artisans, of shoemakers. And the status of the artisans was, and lifestyle, and to some extent income, was higher than the peasants, the campesinos. The vast majority of the residents in these hillside towns in southern Italy were peasants that lived in the town and went out to work in the fields daily, or sometimes they would live actually in the fields in some kind of makeshift arrangement and so on, and then come back to live in town. So the town dwellers who are farmers. It's a pattern that we don't expect and don't imagine. But that becomes very critical in terms of what occurs in the Little Italies, which replicate those towns. But in the case of Covello, they were artisans. So they lived higher up on the hill and not at the bottom. And also they had a somewhat better standard of living, better housing, and he had an uncle that was a priest. This is significant because the priest would have been literate, and the artigiani were generally literate, and Covello's father was literate. He had a small library. He had Giuseppe Mazzini's most important book, A Man's Duty, and that he read, which probably meant he was anti-clerical, which was very common, but anti-clerical maybe with some ideology attached to it. So there's some benefits. Covello's mother was illiterate, and in a pattern that really deserves some study, she arrives in America and becomes sick, and in a sense doesn't leave the bed. There were women that this happened to, other Italian women, it must have occurred in other nationalities, that they were simply overwhelmed. They couldn't tolerate it. I think they went into a type of shock that the world was so different than what they were familiar with, and the situation so miserable that they in many ways stopped functioning. And so Covello did grow up in a very extremely negative situation, but there was some benefits there. The father became the president of what we call in the Puerto Rican community a hometown club. You know, the club from the town itself, and which shows that he had a type of personality that was enabled him to, draw people to him and to and had certain skills. Well, that much we know, but what really seemed to be critical was that in an effort to feed all of these children, and the mother not functioning well, and the father apparently not earning much income, even for someone typical for that place and time, that the children were sent to a settlement house. And a settlement house is an archaic word, and you would wonder why. Today we would call it a community center, but it wasn't called a community center. It was called a settlement house. And the reason is very important, because the staff of the community center settled. They lived there. They lived there. This is something that interests me, frankly, quite a lot. This question of the propinquity of the professional staff and the people giving services in the community and the clientele. So they actually, in a sense, they were kind of like, which I think happened with Covello, they become kind of secular priests and nuns, in a way. They don't take vows, religious vows, or dress differently, but they're dedicating their lives, their total lives, to the destiny of the people that they've concluded that they are going to live with. They don't become them, which is interesting. They don't become Italian, but they live there. Marcantonio's wife was one of them. She married an Italian. That was unusual, you know. But they're there and they spend their lives doing this. I think it's very important because it made them more culturally sensitive and I think more successful in doing what they had committed themselves to do. And they were Protestant. The settlement house, they were always Protestants. I think the equivalent, a Catholic woman would have become a nun, almost for sure, in that arrangement, you know. So in the case of this particular settlement house, which is called the Home Garden, which later evolves into Harlem House, and now which is LaGuardia House in East Harlem, and one of the most important settlement houses in New York City. But it started in a very modest way in a brownstone with a garden. It was called the Home Garden. And Anna Ruddy was the director and founder of that. And she was a Canadian Methodist, I suspect. I'm not 100% positive. Many of these women were Methodists. And really imbibing a form of Protestantism based on the social gospel. It was very typical. Norman Thomas became a Protestant minister, and with a parish, Presbyterian parish in this case, also in Italian Harlem, and again adopts the social gospel. The border between the social gospel and socialism is a very, very, very gray border. And one can move from one to the other very, very easily. With Thomas, for example, of leaving the ministry and becoming a socialist. Anna Ruddy did not do that. But it's fundamentally to live as Jesus lived. And if we look at the gospel, he was living as a kind of a communist, really, you know, sharing and devoting one's life to service, you know, So Covello goes to the Home Gardens, which was in the neighborhood called the Soup School, because they offered bowls of soup to the children, but they also offered the social gospel. And Covello took to this in a very powerful way. And he becomes adopted by Anna Ruddy. Anna Ruddy becomes his mentor, his mother figure. His mother wasn't functioning very well from anything that one could see. And so they find each other. Survivors have that ability. Survivors in difficult situations have this uncanny ability to find rescuers. It's almost like feral, you know, how, you know, I don't want to make a terrible analogy with that, but there's almost this instinctive. No one would know why that would be so. But Covello and Anna Ruddy bond. And he now really incorporates all, I think, the major elements of what become his life. And that would be education, and also to become educated, but also to be of service. And I think those are his motivating concerns. He was one of only 2 boys that went on to Mount Morris High School from his graduating class. Marcantonio was one of only 2 boys, Italian boys, that went to DeWitt Clinton. And in both cases, the other Italian boy dropped out within a semester. So they were the only Italian kids that went to a high school out of their graduating class. And when Covello goes to DeWitt Clinton High School, which had now, by that point, moved as an all-boys school to in the Bronx, he has a rather difficult time there. He's really ashamed of his own background. The kids are more middle class, they're Americans, he can't bring them home, he doesn't fit in with the other students socially, and yet he dropped out of school. out of the economic needs of the household. And you see this very typically with, again, this will happen again in Covello's life, that within the ethos of the Southern Italians, personal needs and desires are subordinated to the family. And so he felt responsible to work and to assist the family, and he drops out of school. What he remembers from that incident is that when he brought the books to the principal office, now remember, he's an A student, a very good student, nobody said a thing. He said, I'm leaving the school, boom. And no handshake, no, you know, he remembered that. I think people like Covello are reflective. You can see it in this wonderful book. I really, really encourage you to buy it. It's $10, it's a good deal. That he's highly, highly reflective on his life, and he's using his life experience, he's using his injuries as material for progress for himself and other people. And that's a successful life, is that people that don't become narcissistic about their injuries and think that people owe them something, but they actually do the reverse. They ruminate on their injuries and find solutions which they then share with other people. And I think that's Covello. Well, with Anna Ruddy's, he returns to the school and continues his trajectory of being the excellent student. With Anna Ruddy's help, he gets a scholarship, Pulitzer Scholarship, to go to Columbia College to study Romance languages. This was extraordinarily unusual for a Southern Italian immigrant kid of that period, almost unique. There would have been very few examples of that. And he succeeds. And his destiny is to teach in college. He had an offer to teach in Wellesley. His mother dies. Well, now he has to go, he has to take care of the family. So he can't leave. There's no way he can leave. So what he does is he gets a job temporarily at Dewey Clinton High School. Well, you know, rejection is God's protection. That's a good affirmation. And the reason we're talking about him today is that because he didn't go to Wellesley, but that he went to Dewey Clinton High School, because that becomes the basis for his life's work. When he arrives at Dewey Clinton, there were very few Italian students, and they were doing terribly. It was a very highly prestigious school at the time, something like Stuyvesant today, but with really 40, maybe not many more than 40, maybe 50 Italian students out of a very large school population. They were doing terribly. And the suggestion of a student said that he was given the task by the principal, can you do something with these students? They're doing awful. And you're the only Italian teacher here, Italian-American teacher. So he uses his settlement house experience to do what was done at the settlement house, which was to organize something. The settlement houses were always very great believers. You organize sewing circles, you organize reading circles, athletic groups, study circles. The whole idea of trying to develop a kind of civic mindedness and cooperativeness, with people, and seeing that as creating resources for uplift for individuals by working cooperatively. And so Covello starts at Circolo Italiano with the Italian kids in the school, and he doesn't have a clear plan whatsoever. But he again, from his settlement house background, he takes these students who are in trouble. And he sends them back to the communities to work in the settlement house in Italian Harlem, to tutor junior high school students and help the immigrants to become citizens. That's how you win. That's how people grow, and that's how people learn, and that's how people gain strength, by helping other people. So I think what was very interesting, Bill, there are certain aspects of his life which are original. I'll try to get to them. I'll get to them somehow today, but there are aspects. But what he's really so critical for, I think, is that he's applying theory and practice in specific areas and then modifying that to work in those areas. That's what I'm very struck by. In other words, these types of general theories, like cultural pluralism, for example, is not particularly original from Covello, but his application within those settings makes it original in some very critical ways. So he sends the students back into the community to help their others, the others from their background, to move forward. And in the process, some important things happen. This is how leadership develops. Leadership skills develop, and self-confidence develops, and self-esteem develops. So it's by helping other people. So he's using what he learned from Anna Ruddy and learned from the Congressman. In the meantime, he became a Protestant, which was extraordinarily unusual. My guess is that the Italian Catholicism is very much like Judaism. It's highly cultural, and you can't leave it. You can't escape, because the culture doesn't leave you a way out. So you can say all the rules are garbage and they're nonsense and superstition, but you're stuck. You're stuck with it. And I think that's what happens with Italians. So if they'll leave the church, but they don't stop being culturally Catholic. There's no way out, in a way, for them. So 1% is probably almost generous for how many Italians became Protestant. Somebody should write a book on it. Some of them are interesting, but the list is fairly brief. But now the students, he has something going with these students. There's something happening that's successful. A student asks him, he goes, Dr. Covello, he goes, why can't we study Italian? Why do we have to study German? Covello, in the Italian ghetto, with the kids right off the boat, they taught them German in the public schools. It's almost beyond belief. It's ludicrous beyond all belief that you have these immigrants coming in from southern Italy, hardly speaking English, and they go to the primary school to learn German. It's unbelievable, but that's what occurred in the New York public school system. I think things that absurd continue to occur, by the way. And with some distance, we see the ones from the past, but they're right under our nose. So the student says, why? And what Covello said, he goes, the only thing he ever heard about anything Italian was Columbus. Nothing else. There was never any mention of a name or a place or an event at all. That there was this kind of dismissal by omission of a culture of the children and their families, as if they didn't exist. They were invisible. They had no reality to them. So a student asked him that, and he said, well, we'll look into it. And he starts the first Italian class in the public school system of New York. In the first class is Vito Marcantonio. Now, this is also going back to that relationship. I'd like to just mention for a moment, in my own research about Marcantonio, I could see how very critical that was for Marcantonio that he learned Italian, because deep, right to the very end, he was speaking in Italian on the street corners, the language persisted much longer. In America, there's such a stigmatization of ethnicity, particularly of not all ethnicities equally, by the way, but of ethnicities of people that have low economic and social status. There's a stigmatization. And I've noticed this myself. This the second generation says they don't know the language, and they do. They know the language and say, I don't speak Italian, but they know Italian. So it's fascinating. So this became a great asset to Marcantonio as a leader in East Harlem, but actually throughout the Italian community in New York City. Became a major base for the left and for him, and knowing the language was very critical. Now, when Covello starts teaching Italian, at the time, Italian was not accepted as academically to fulfill the requirements for the Regents exam. That a student would have to take either Spanish, French, German, that might have been it, German, Spanish, French, I think that might have been it, and 2 courses in that area to get the Regents, the college-destined diploma. So how are they going to get enrollment for Italian courses if the course isn't a prerequisite for the degree? It would have to be taken as a second language, something that very, very few students would ever do. So what Covello does is mobilize with the Italian Teachers Association, mobilizes a citywide campaign to petition the Board of Education to have the Italian language accepted on an equal basis for the Regents exam. Now, I think this is very important to looking at Covello, is that the use of using an organization. Again, this goes back, in his case, not so much to an experience of being a leftist. This goes back to his experience of being part of the settlement house movement, of using organizations and gathering people together to obtain goals. And an Italian, a very intensive campaign of 2 years, the Italian was accepted as a prerequisite for that degree. Now, Covello then becomes vice president and the guiding light of the Italian Teachers Association from that point on. So he's now teaching in the high school, and he's also vice president, and for a period, president of the Italian Teachers Association. The necessity of organization can't be emphasized enough. If there's no group to advocate for a position, to have the knowledge, the expertise, to draw the resources together, there will be no result. There'll be pageantry and emotion and no forward motion. And that followed by withdrawal, depression, and cynicism. There has to be organization. Without organization, nothing happens. What did Lenin say? He goes, the weapon of the working class is organization, organization, organization. Organize in a sewing circle if you must, but organize. That is our power. We are many, they are few. But without organization, we're powerless. And we're just really wasting our own time, our own lives, and not achieving anything, and not attracting anyone. So with the Italian Teachers Association, which still exists, by the way, they lobby and obtain, they have Italian. Now, Covello is beginning to put together a strategy of education, which is absolutely remarkable, which he terms community-centered education. And the community-centered education had 2 large goals. One was to activate what was a basically inert community and fatalistic community with very, very little activity. And my colleagues, Simone Ginotto, will talk about that part of it. But the other part, which of community-centered education, the other aspect of it, large aspect of it, was Covello concludes that the major cause for the very, very poor academic progress of Italian school children is the disjuncture between the ethos, the Southern Italian ethos, and the ethos of the public school system. that the ethos of the family loyalty, taking priority over all other considerations, clash with the individualism of the ethos of the public school system. And what he noted is, and I think this was original, something highly original, was he notices that in the elementary school, the students accede to the school, and they accept the authority of the school, and do not resist the efforts of Americanization in the schools. When the teacher first makes Leonardo Leonard, one teacher, no, he accepted that. When another teacher the next year changes his surname from Covello to Covello, when he went home, his parents were outraged. He defended the teacher. So the elementary school students identified and accepted the authority of the Americanizing teachers and the institution. When they arrived in high school, they begin resisting that. They have the ability to do that. Perhaps also because they're going to be starting their own families, and their loyalty shifts back to the family and the community, and they begin resisting the school, either by acting out and becoming problem students, or by dropping out. And what Covello's formula, schema, really, strategy, is cultural pluralism. And to bring the language, the original language, into the school, and have the students learn the language, but with a cultural emphasis. They have, it's good that they learn the conjugations of the irregular verbs, but the real goal is that they have something of the knowledge, so that they can have a bond with the parents and with the community, and some method of communication within the family, and then the family with the community back to the students, and that the students not see their own culture and their families, therefore, as something inferior and less valuable. And that was the beginning, starting with the language, which was extremely successful. The amount of Italian taught in all the high schools, in all the little Italies, that enormous enrollments. And then later, he becomes a founding principal of Benjamin Franklin High School. The other parts of this community-centered education strategy are put in place, with having, the infusion of the original cultures into the curricula, into the English classes, assemblies, which kind of celebrated the cultures of all the different students. Student clubs, they had the Hostos club, it's amazing, and they had a Frederick Douglass club, and creating really a very high level of democracy within a public school institution. And there's so much more to say about Covello, but I think I better leave something for my colleague to say. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, our next presenter, directly from Torino, Italy, is Simone Cinotto. He's an associate professor of history at the Università di Polenzo in Italy, and the next visiting scholar at the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University. He's the author of Italian-American Table, Food, Family, and Community in New York City, which is a really terrific book. I recommend it highly. And Soft Soil Grapes, The Birth of Italian Winemaking in California. He's the editor of Making Italian America, Consumer Culture and the Production of Ethnic Identities, which is a Fordham University Press book, and the co-editor with Hasia Dinner of Global Jewish Foodways, A History, and that's forthcoming from the University of Nebraska Press. So let's welcome Simone.
I'm gonna speak from the podium, not to look more authoritative, because I need to turn the slides of my presentation, and also I'm gonna read my paper, actually my electronic, whatever it's called, for the sake of staying within the time limits. Professor Mayor already provided us with a very good overview of the life and the biography of Leonard Covello, especially as an educator. I'm gonna talk about basically his leadership in mobilizing the East Harlem community for the introduction of the first public housing in the neighborhood between 1937 and 1941. That housing project, which of course is still there today, East River Houses. Let me go to my first picture here. This photograph that you see there was taken on March 25, 1939 on East 108th Street in the heart of East Harlem. At the time, the area was home to the largest, repeating a little bit what Professor Mayer said, was home to the largest Italian community in the United States, actually in the Western Hemisphere. Some 80,000 first and second generation Italian immigrants were concentrated in the easternmost section of the neighborhood from 3rd Avenue to the East River. The western section from 3rd to 5th Avenue was predominantly Puerto Rican, some African American, and the remnants of what has been the second largest Jewish community in the city, plus other, I don't remember the exact number, but several dozen other ethnic communities were represented in East Harlem at that time, making it probably exceptional in the whole world in terms of the diversity. The women in the photograph were parading to demand the administration of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia the construction of a federal subsidized low-rent housing project in Italian Harlem. Italian Harlem had been the district that elected LaGuardia to Congress between 1922 and 1932 and gave him landslide support in the mayoral elections. The women are passing by a storefront displaying a sign, the Communist Party of the United States, East Harlem section. You see it, of course, in the background. It may not be a random choice for the photographer to have the hammer and sickle in the background. The parade was co-sponsored by the Harlem Legislative Conference, a political organization dominated by Vito Marcantonio, who, as we know well, represented East Harlem in Congress 5 times between 1932 and 1950. The Harlem Legislative Conference was a popular front coalition of over 100 left organizations, including the Communist Party, unions, settlement houses, parent-teacher association, and social and athletic clubs, whose primary purpose was to improve living conditions and fight racial discrimination in the community. Photographers documenting the initiative of the AJLC were often reporters for the Communist Party paper, The Daily Worker. Gravely ahead, the women paid no attention to the communist symbol. The black dresses, the hair discreetly combed back, the unpretentious shoes and cotton stockings of the 3 women on the right, including the one who carries an Italian flag, suggest that they are respectable mothers in the Italian tradition. The fur collar of the coat of the woman on the left carrying the Star-Spangled Banner, the only one looking possibly non-Southern Italian, is the only concession to alternate cultural influences. These are women embedded in the feminist ideology and practices that Italian-American historian Robert Hostos kind of famously called the Domus Center Society. Supposedly unaccustomed to walk the street for much else than visiting relatives and shopping for bargains in the neighborhood markets. The black purses all of them carry in their hand suggest the important unpaid work of caring that these women perform on a daily basis inside tenement kitchens, from window sills and across backyards, or in hospital rooms where they spend visits to sick relatives. As Covello noted in his studies, an all-encompassing family ideology and community relationships based on a shared moral code was the core of the ethnic identity of Italian Harlem, and what they thought distinguished them from any other race. The central social value of their experience as immigrants was their determination to become homeowners, either in New York or in Italy. by pulling together every family resource and sacrificing the pursuit of different paths to social mobility, including most of the time the education of their own children. I think this was the migration project of the father of Leonard Covello himself. This private goal of ownership was also apparently at odds with the investment in the struggle for low-rent public housing. Yet, this single photograph is an evidence that in the late 1930s, Italians in Harlem acted collectively to demand that the state provide for what they understood to be their entitlement, the social right of a decent house, as proclaimed by President Roosevelt in his second inauguration speech in 1936. They mobilized under the guidance of Italian-American leaders that they are endorsed to represent them as Italians in the local and national political arena. Leonard Covello, Vito Marcantonio, Fiorello LaGuardia. They did so, as this parading model suggests, not by rebutting their own ethnic culture of domesticity, but by bestowing political value to it. This ethnic materialism, symbolized by the Italian flag and the purse, trespassing spheres and being invested in the struggle for better housing, is scarcely acknowledged in the history of Italian America. Even recent contributions maintain that the Italian family ethics and its emphasis on motherhood is the burden in spite of which a minority of Italian Americans participated in class struggle and political activism. Documenting the agency of these Italian mothers in black, reclaiming the most political charged space of all, the street, and carrying out concerted community action, asks us to work at a more nuanced and historical complicated interpretation of Italian American ethnicity.
Great photo.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
This basically is the journal, is the issue of the journal, the Educational Forum, from where the photograph was drawn, and basically this is the I think it's the most comprehensive text in which where Leonard Covello talks about this experiment in mobilizing the Italian community toward the goal of public housing. It's a January 1943 issue. The mobilization for public housing was eventually successful. In a matter of 2 years, on a 4-block area between First Avenue and the East River, Italian Harlem got its new 1,200-unit housing project, East River Houses, the first high-rise tower project to be built in New York City. It was the sixth housing project to be built by the city. One of the first with federal funds. Because of this success, the case study may have a larger historical lesson to teach. Many political scientists insist that multiculturalism jeopardizes welfare state policies, either because multicultural policies are seen as imposing extra economic burden on welfare state budgets, or because by awarding more rights to particular groups, they discredit the principle of universalism and undermine the support to the welfare state. Some important histories of working class America reinforce this idea, describing the post-World War I era as an era during which non-unionized immigrant workers, clustering culturally homogeneous ethnic enclaves, relied on ethnic institutions for support in case of need, and the 1930s as at the third time when, with the demise of the ethnic institution unable to cope with the Depression, immigrants finally made an American working class by rallying around the New Deal, the Democratic Party, and the CIO across ethnic lines. In other words, the history suggests that one can have either universalistic redistributive social politics or cultural recognition, but not both. The case of Italian Harlem struggle for public housing illustrates an effort at bridging these apparent alternative demands. The tension between cultural recognition and universal social policy explain the oddity of a man like Covello, a high school principal, public intellectual, and cultural ethnic leader, becoming the real hero of the movement that brought low-rent public housing to Italian Harlem. He mobilized his school and the community around the issue of public housing because of the practical, tangible result that a badly needed housing project would bring in the life of the local people, but also because of how decent housing would reflect in the self-understanding of discriminated, alienated, and demoralized minorities as full American citizens. As Covello wrote, I'm quoting, actually from this journal. In New York, the majority of our foreign cultural communities, our Little Italies, our Jewish ghettos, our Chinatown, our Negro Harlem, and so on and so forth, are distinguished by their unusually bad housing conditions. As a slum or an area of dilapidated housing, wherever such condition exists, suffer from the disrepute that becomes attached to it. And it is evident that when such areas are populated by people of foreign stock, the disrepute of a community transcends the social-physical connotations and resolves itself into antagonism toward particular cultural groups. On the other hand, the propensity of the dilapidated physical environment to make people socially inhibited, to cause them to hold themselves aloof, and to endow them with a sense of inferiority. Therefore, our growing interest in the housing problem, especially where it involves foreign communities, should go beyond humanitarian considerations. It is a question not alone of ensuring better health or better standards of living, but it is also a question of rehabilitating all communities and the low social and cultural prestige attached to their people. The mobilization for better housing in Italian Harlem stemmed from the disastrous condition of its housing stock, in fact, which by 1937 ranked among the worst in New York City. Unlike Central or West Harlem, which had originally been an upper middle class suburb, East Harlem had always been a working class neighborhood, a home for transient groups of immigrants attracted to the area by its low rent tenement houses. By 1934, 90% of housing in the section east of 3rd Avenue, the most Italian part of the neighborhood, had been built in the previous century. In the most heavily Italian blocks, 83% of the apartments lacked central heating, 67% lacked a tub or a shower, and 55% a private indoor toilet. While the worst dwelling remained vacant and rapidly decayed, some experienced extreme overcrowding, providing the ideal conditions for the spreading of disease. From 1936 to 1940, the tuberculosis mortality rate in Italian Harlem was double the average of the city as a whole. Covello first-handedly experienced the effect of the evils of the slum. As a child, he saw his immigrant mother pine away and die, never able to reconcile with life in the tenement flats of Harlem. In 1918, his wife died of an unnamed disease that doctors advised to cure with better air and sunlight. The scars that this death left on him had a tremendous impact in making an advocacy campaign to bring low-income public housing to East Harlem, the top priority of his life as a teacher, social reformer, and community leader in the years 1937-1941. Okay, this is Covello and Vito Marcantonio, wife María Sanders at the first rally for public housing in East Harlem. The 1937 U.S. Housing Act, which made adequate housing for low-income families a permanent responsibility of the government, provided Covello with a framework for action. Together with María Sanders, the head worker of the largest settlement house in Italian Harlem, Harlem House, Covello participated in the East Harlem study of the Mayor's Committee on City Planning. The committee, on the one hand, recommended demolition and reconstruction on a large scale for doomed Italian Harlem. But on the other, it envisioned a future in which the richly textured social networks of the community and its distinct ethnic character would only remain intact, but thrive, liberated by the negative stigma of the slum. The 1937 final report of the Mayor's Committee hoped that much of the traditions and culture of Italy will be preserved to enrich the outlook of the Americas of Italian forebears who will live here in the future. In that case, the area might develop as the principal center of Italian culture in the Western Hemisphere. Then East Harlem will become noted as a neighborhood that combines the beauty and the glory of the old world with the outlook and vision of the new.
Where was Leonard Covello?
Yeah, I was going to ask him, the
that
photo
previous-
you just showed, can you identify?
No.
Yeah.
Is he in the back?
You can identify more people?
No, I'm saying,
Okay.
where is Leonard Covello in this picture?
Oh, sorry, right. Covello is the second from right. The with glasses and the hat.
The tall one
Not-
is Marcantonio's wife,
Right,
Yeah,
Mary,
Wow, she's tall.
yeah.
5 inches taller than me.
No, I took for granted that
No, Marcantonio, is Marcantonio the second from the right?
No.
he's
No,
not there.
no, it's not a picture.
Oh, it's not there. Okay, I got it. Oh, I see. Okay, never mind.
I have another picture where the both of the
Got it,
picture
got it.
I show. At Benjamin Franklin School, Covello redesigned the entire curriculum, from literature to art classes, to address the issue of housing and its relevance for the community. Within the community center school model that Gerald Meyer just illustrated. This was the practical application of this model. Students mapped any single block in the neighborhood, created models, graphs, and drawings, attended lectures and motion picture screenings about social housing in New York and Europe. Let me just digress a second. But this is also part, I would say, of the strong involvement of the strong public involvement of Covello as a teacher. All this material, all these photographs come from the Leonard Covello archives, which are for some weird reasons in Philadelphia. So he documented all these efforts and activities. Actually, documentation and preservation of the documents was part of what he feels was his mission. So we have a number. We have really very detailed information of all the activities of the school. The picture that you see in the upper right, the two students are basically illustrating this very large map of East Harlem, which was the final result of a number of students going around the neighborhood and getting information about everything, about any single block. Who lived there, who they were, the condition of the buildings, who the landlord was, and they got into any single food shop, and they interviewed the owner. This is incredible. Is a wealth of information for me, especially as a food historian. Most of the first section of my book is really heavily relies on this information that Covello students actually collected. So students map any single block in the neighborhood, created models, graphs, and drawings, attended lectures and motion picture screenings about social housing in New York and Europe. The language departments translated material in Italian and Spanish for the non-English speaking people. Parents and civic associations were involved in all events, and a housing committee was formed to provide for a permanent forum on housing for immigrant families. Again, more material from the Covello papers. Wow. Covello understood that the school needed political alliances to effectively influence decision makers. To that purpose, the Benjamin Franklin Housing Committee joined forces with Vito Marcantonio's Harlem Legislative Conference to form the East Harlem Housing Committee. In the next 3 years, the Joint Committee would sponsor rallies, parades, and petition drives. You see, for example, in the middle, one of the sheets that were circulated by a number of people from settlement houses, churches, tenant association, you name it, around the neighborhood. And you see, for example, on this block, how many Puerto Ricans and Italians live together. An additional goal of the agency and Covello was to foster unity and cross-racial cooperation among Italians, Puerto Ricans, and African Americans. There was some cooperation between the groups, but the campaign remained, however, mostly in Italian hands. Flyers and speeches were given in English, Italian, and Spanish. You see one in Italian on the right, but mass meetings were always celebrated in Italian Harlem. In fact, the mobilizing language that Covello and Marcantonio used throughout the housing campaign reflected their attempt at accommodating their own progressive agendas with the cultural inclinations and values of the Italians of Harlem. Two childless, visionary men in a community obsessed with family and motherhood, Covello and Marcantonio had to navigate cautiously between the two ends. Covello in particular soon realized that his own feelings about the housing situation in East Harlem differed from those of the immigrants. For the latter, East Harlem tenement conditions, as squalid as they were still above what they had experienced in southern Italy. Covello noted, congestion, a family of 8 living in 2 rooms and a half, is to them not a housing evil, but a very prudent and thrifty arrangement. Remember always this very strong social value of saving whatever possible in order to buy a house or buy some property. Rather than trying to hammer middle-class notions of decent housing in Italian heads, Covello tried to stimulate a growing awareness of the housing problem through the practice of community education. He insisted that mobilization was a goal in itself, as it entailed a lesson in cooperation to a people estranged to the very notion of it. Most often, Covello articulated his messages in the family culture code that Harlem's Italians could immediately understand and made sense of. The participation of the community in the housing movement, in fact, reached its apex on March 18, 1939, when a fire broke out in 112th Street tenement. The East Harlem Housing Committee circulated an impassioned leaflet denouncing the tragedy that had killed 5 innocent children who were peacefully asleep. The Italian community, outraged by the images of family destructions, responded by sending hundreds of letters of protest and attending by the thousand the following mass housing parade, announced in the flyer on the left. As a radical politician, Marcantonio used a more bellicose style, relying on the sense of isolation and estrangement for the larger society that Italians in Harlem experienced. When he talked of the reactionary forces that revived the multiracial nature of East Harlem, innately the idea that the community stood up for its right, he provided the community with a useful, faceless enemy to whom they could express resentment and frustration. When at some point voices spread that private speculators may have tried to buy the attractive riverfront land where the public housing project was supposed to raise, Marcantonio delivered a heated radio address that played on the sense of territoriality of Harlem's Italian. Quote, "The East River is our river. We learned to swim in that river. We were born on its banks and we want that river for ourselves. If it is our river, we do not intend to have anybody take it away from us." In fact, it's very interesting, studying the story, understanding how gentrification was already part of the picture, even before public housing was introduced. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that later. Okay. Now, this material, instead, these photographs come from the booklet that Nisha published to present East River houses when they were opened in 1941. Wow. This is supposed to be a documentation of the very poor condition of housing in East Harlem, both hygienic and safety dangers that that kind of living condition provided. So now let's talk about the people. The participation of the people of Italian Harlem to the campaign for low-rent public housing set an unprecedented moment in the life of the community. Hundreds of immigrant women and men attended the Forum on Housing at Benjamin Franklin High School together with their children. Remember what Professor María just said, the generational conflict, the generational misunderstandings between the immigrant parents and their children. There was one very urgent and important preoccupation of Leonard Covello's work. This participation provided an opportunity for immigrant parents and their American-born generation to fill a chasm that had represented one of the most painful incidents in Italian Harlem history. Also, Robert Orsi, if you read the book, The Madonna 150th Street, talks a lot about this generational conflict or gap. By the end of the campaign, the East Harlem Housing Committee had met 58 times. Immigrant grassroots activists are conducted community signatures of housing petitions, as we said, distributed leaflets, pamphlets, and buttons, attended several mass meetings, and participated in one mass protest parade and one victory parade. On September 18, 1939, Marcantonio LaGuardia officially announced that the federal government in Washington had agreed to subsidize the building of these warehouses between 102nd and 105th Street near East River Drive. Italian Harlemites again launching a mass distribution of application forms and guidelines to secure that the maximum number of area residents were selected as tenants for the housing project. The participation of women, as we saw, was momentous. Women's newfound grassroots activism stemmed from a social change that we can call depression maternalism. Record numbers of men were out of work by the end of the 1930s. Italian Harlem had the highest percentage of head of families on relief in New York City. With few jobs available to them, children stayed in school longer. Classes at Benjamin Franklin High School as well, providing Covello with a wide audience for his experiments in educational reform and social action. Women were invested with unprecedented responsibilities as consumers and personally in charge to deal with welfare agencies. The patriarchal framework of family economy, which was responsible for the total mobilization of resources toward the goal of home ownership, weakened, while a new awareness of the welfare needs of women and children, including better and safer housing, emerged. As a result, not only women were more numerous and more active than men, but they introduced gender meanings to the housing movement, visions and needs that went beyond the intended goal of the campaign, making their voices publicly heard like never before. Women's activism could doubtless emerge because housing was traditionally seen as an area of female competence, because women performed their political activities in the street of the neighborhood that were familiar to them and closely monitored, and because remaining in close proximity to their homes and children, they could continue to perform their labor as mothers or wives. However, as the campaign mounted, groups of Italian women began to challenge both the physical boundaries of the neighborhood and the limits of their action. For example, in early 1939, some of them formed a delegation of mothers, as they identified themselves, and made regular visits to the mayor and the chairman of NISHA to hand them the petition that they had collected in Italian Harlem. They used their authority as mothers to press main politicians and bureaucrats to take action and meet their housing needs, thus claiming the new roles for themselves as citizens, consumers, and transforming their emphasis on motherhood in public policy. Now, this is the, yeah, okay, can finish. This is the groundbreaking ceremony of East River Houses, March 2nd, 1940, and here we have Covello and Vito Marcantonio on the same podium.
That's Marcantonio.
And Covello.
That's Covello, right?
And who's that, Jerry?
On the left is LaGuardia.
Oh, and LaGuardia, sorry. Yes.
I have 5 more minutes, or I can stop here?
Maybe you should stop here, yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Ready? Should I bring the vote
Too much to say.
down? Too much to say, right? Roberto is going to come up and read another section from the heart.
So the original plan was I had 2 other readings, so I only have time for one of them?
Yeah, I think so, because we want to leave a little Q&A.
Okay, all right. So there's the reading on the name change and the one where he meets Marcantonio. Which of the 2 should I do?
When he meets Marcantonio.
When he meets Marcantonio, okay. So there's a in the biography there is this moment where he describes in detail how he came home and the teacher had changed his first name and then he changed his last name, and it's really a traumatic moment for the parents. So I encourage you to buy the biography so you can read that and many other things.
How much is it?
We talked about. It's, how much is it? It's $10.
Wow.
It's a big, we discount everything at these events. So, so this is also from the book, and this is actually, and I actually rewrote it a bit so sections, the Marcantonio moments can be dramatized, since I've dramatized Marcantonio for the Vito Marcantonio Forum. And I dramatize a grown-up Marcantonio by symbolizing it with wearing a fedora, but since this is a Marcantonio as a child, I'm not wearing any hats today. So, so this is, okay, so this is the part of the heart of the teacher. Covello describes a meeting, reflecting on Vito Marcantonio. Okay. The name of one of my East Harlem students was to become well known to New Yorkers. He was Vito Marcantonio. Mark, everyone called him. Short of stature and slender of build, Mark was a volcano of energy. He became involved in everything that had to do with the curricula and the Italian department. Some of the students called him a socialist, though I'm sure that not many of them had any idea what they meant by it, except that Mark was always discussing world affairs, politics, and labor conditions. Once I unexpectedly came upon Mark berating a group of fellow students. "You birds don't even know you're alive. I'll bet you that this very minute there is some guy outside there trying to figure out how he's going to make money off your hides when you go out looking for a job. You don't even know that." There were enough students around who disliked Mark's offhand oratory and, quote, socialistic, unquote, tendencies to keep him from being elected president of the curricula. This did not bother Mark. Instead, he managed to have the organizational setup revised and had himself elected chairman of the executive committee with powers over the president himself. When he had accomplished this, he came to my office and told me about it, laughing for all he was worth. "Pop, you are now looking at the chief executive of the Circolo Italiano." He said. Mark was the first to start calling me Pop, a name which my boys would have used ever since. This was when Fiorello LaGuardia was president of the Board of Aldermen of New York. World War I was recent enough so that everyone still called him Major. Dr. Paul, the president of DeWitt Clinton High School, asked if I could arrange to have the Major speak to the boys at one of our assemblies. It was a good idea. LaGuardia could be very stimulating, particularly to young people. They were attracted by his facial expressions and they loved his act. The way he would sputter and hiss and pound his fist into his palm, and they would listen to what he had to say. I sought out LaGuardia at his office and he readily accepted the invitation. It was in the days when he would go anywhere and into any amount of trouble to make a speech. However, in order to give the occasion an added air of importance, we decided that a student speaker should precede LaGuardia. As a gracious gesture towards LaGuardia's background, Mark was elected. It would be difficult for anyone to forget the startled faces of the students gathered at the assembly that day when Mark stepped onto the speaker's platform and said, "This morning I'm going to talk about old age pensions and Social Security." I had known that Mark was going to talk about that. Now I was hoping he would be able to put it across. In a few moments, there was complete silence in the auditorium as Mark's impassioned voice pressed the argument. "For providing for the old age of people who with their labor had helped to build America, but who had never been able to earn more than enough to feed their children and pay for the clothes on their backs. For if it is true that government is of the people and for the people, then it is the duty of government to provide for those who, through no fault of their own, have been unable to provide for themselves. It is the social responsibility of every citizen to see that these laws for older people are enacted." He spoke passionately, eloquently, and I know sincerely. The applause which followed as Mark backed away from the lectern convinced me more than ever that adolescents are far more capable of serious thought and understanding than they are given credit for being. While other boys could poke fun at Mark and kid him along, When he spoke, they listened. LaGuardia shook Mark's hand and slapped him on the shoulder in a congratulatory gesture. Then in his own inimitable way, he thrust out his chin and picked up the thread of Mark's speech and used it as a basis of his own talk. "Our neglected citizens," his audience howled. Assembly that day was a huge success. The students, Dr. Paul, and all of the teachers were pleased, even excited. Most important of all for LaGuardia and Marcantonio, it was the beginning of an association and friendship which was to endure for many years. Almost as soon as he had finished law school, Mark went to work in LaGuardia's law office, became involved in politics, and managed LaGuardia's congressional campaigns in East Harlem. When LaGuardia was elected mayor of New York in 1933, Mark was elected to replace him in Congress.
Okay, we have, I think we have a few more minutes. Is there a panel right behind us, you know, Jerry?
I think so.
Oh, good, okay. So we just have a few minutes if anybody has any comments or any questions they'd like to ask any of the presenters. Yes. Yes.
You mentioned in your talk about Covello going to Sicily at the invitation of Daniele Dolci. So how old was he at that point, and how many years did he work with him?
I think he was in Italy for 10 years. It's amazing. Yeah.
So he was in his 70s? I mean, how old was he?
He died in 95. So he
82.
Yeah, he went when he was 82.
And he worked from 82 to 90. And what exactly, do you have any idea what his work was?
He worked with elderly, apparently. Dolci's a wonderful figure, I think that's been forgotten.
Yeah.
And he won the Stalin Peace Prize, by the way. So he had to be good. But in any case, but Dolci was a remarkable figure. He was not a communist, but he worked with the communists, and he developed some tactics, kind of passive resistance tactics, you might say, that we could even think about today. He would gather the unemployed and have them complete a project, like to build a wall, to repair a road, or to build a dike. And then, after they worked for a week, to go to the city hall for their pay and stay there until they were paid. They had the evidence of their work, in a sense.
So what you're saying is Covello just went to work with him. He didn't develop his own programs there.
I know he worked with Dolci. There's some documentation, but not a lot. Covello wrote back every year with a kind of a report of what he did. He sent some personal letters, but there's no archival material, unfortunately. When he died in Palermo, and in the home of a colleague of his that he had written the first Italian language textbook for high school in the United States of America, and he's buried in Italy. But he was a socialist. He was a socialist, Covello, and I think, like Dolci, the work with communists. I think that was his politics, in fact.
But 80 years old. He's pretty old already, huh?
Well, I think that someone like Covello, which would the work was their life was work. I mean, they didn't. There was also very Italian, the idea of kind of, I think, looking down at adults playing, to some extent. That you worked. Life was about work, and you stopped for ceremonial situations, family dinners, religious holidays, but you were supposed to work, and children were supposed to work, and old people were supposed to work. It's very, the feudalism was not far away from their lives. I mean, the feudal structure, social structure, and the arrangements of family and so on were patriarchal, but also with the woman gaining power over time, very interesting patterns. But I don't think he expected anything else. I mean, that's what he wanted to do.
I always found it amazing that Dolce didn't get assassinated by the mafia.
Yeah.
But it might have had something to do with the fact that he was not a Southerner. He was from northern Italy. Any other comments or questions? Okay, I want to remind people that we have some really interesting reading material that it's for sale, it's discounted. And please, if you're interested in learning more about us, to go to our websites and sign up on the email list. And we hope to see you again at our next event.
I have a question.
Oh,
Sorry. This question is for Simone, well, really anyone. You know, you talked about, the beginnings of public housing, which is such a big part of our lives here. Like in NYCHA, that's as big as Boston. And a lot of people don't realize that's how big NYCHA is. So I was just wondering, in terms of starting that, who were some other names? Like you talked about Marcantonio, LaGuardia, but who were some other people who we could research on our own?
Okay, there is a wonderful article by a scholar called, I don't remember his name, I think Robert Marcuse, like the philosopher, about the early years of NYCHA and public housing in New York. So you see how many people was involved in the movement, how many women were involved, people coming from social work, settlement houses, politics. I think that the most important part of the story is the fact that public housing back then was understood as quite different to how we think about it right now. It was really produced by the Depression. So the first, it was not supposed to house desperate people or the very poor. It was supposed to be to provide, again, as Roosevelt said, decent housing mostly for working class people out of work. It was supposed to be even temporary. It was supposed to be a much better housing than the slum that sometimes replaced. Not to replace slum with slum. In fact, it was supposed to increase the real estate value of the area where it was introduced. It was mostly the starting point. It was supposed to provide jobs for unemployed people and to help the construction industry to start again from the standstill where it was at the time. So the concept was quite new. I mean, the slum clearance of slum removal, which became associated with public housing after the war, it was a different problem, a different issues than public housing itself. In fact, the first public housing that was the first project that was built. Actually, the first example in New York is on East 3rd Street. It's called the First Houses, and it was the model housing of the time, supposed to provide good housing, state-of-the-art housing, not cheap housing for people that was completely decent, respectable people that was out of work, so he was in that kind of condition, and it was not supposed to be an alternative to social mobility. It was supposed to be an emergency rescue intervention of the city, and then after 1937 of the federal state for these exceptional times. So the concept of public housing before and after the war is quite different. In fact, okay, I don't want to.
I think also with public housing, I think that we've allowed ourselves to slide into really a right-wing position, reactionary position on this issue, and to take up the point of view that public housing is substandard housing, to denigrate it, devalue it, when in fact it's an extraordinary success. We have 600,000 people in New York City living in public housing. The waiting list for public housing is 400,000 people, and not one single housing project in New York City has ever been demolished. It's all intact, and it's really, they're situated on, in a way that every room has sunlight, and the rooms are spacious, there's community facilities, and it allows for, it's the one, we talk about how do you stop gentrification. Well, what stops gentrification is public housing. That's what stops it. And there's probably nothing else that could. And yet we don't, there's no advocacy for it. Even de Blasio talks about in the green areas of public housing to build middle income housing, taking away the lawns and so on. It's really a shame. But also to be less presentist. I mean, people lived in houses, there was no central heating. I was born in such a place. I lived there for quite a few years. There was a coal stove in the middle of the kitchen, period. That was it for the for the heating in the apartment. There was no hot water. You had to make your own hot water. There was a sink in the kitchen that you were bathed in. I mean,
Don't forget the icebox.
Oh, an icebox. Well, but you can even bring that to the public housing project, the icebox. But the housing conditions were terrible, and no housing was built during the war, and no housing had been built during the Depression. So there was this extraordinary scarcity, and so it's a great victory. But I think using the school, having the school as the base for the campaign is extraordinary. And what Covello, I think, saw is that the public school was the only institution that had the possibility of affecting the community as a whole. And to use a school, which he did in Benjamin Franklin High School, to have the night school where the parents could learn English, become citizens, and also learn skills. And in the daytime, the students learning Italian and having a curriculum which did not stigmatize the community, but saw the community as something positive and a means of learning, and as a kind of laboratory from which the students themselves could learn.
Okay, I'm sorry, do you have a question?
You used a term I didn't understand. It sounded like a slum.
No, slum.
Slum.
You were very different.
Right. No, just add a line about a very important issue which is race. Of course, it's also the big difference between pre- and post-war public housing. It was not something supposed to be a place where to segregate minorities of color, but race was, of course, part of the picture from the very beginning. In fact, the second and third public housing project, Williamsburg houses and Harlem area houses were de facto segregated, and the East River houses were instead heavily integrated. There was 80% of the first tenants were black. A small minority of Puerto Ricans were also among the first tenants. Now, the developments of the story after World War II, of course, and the work of Moses and so on and so forth will lead public housing in a very different way. But the story of integration in very important, racial integration is very important in East River houses. And again, the role of Covello Marcantonio was vital in that sense.
David?
I just want to add, another role for the public schools back then was the provision of health services, which, was really omnipresent. People can still find in old schools old dental chairs and things, and now it's come back, but it's semi-privatized because I worked in a school-based clinic, and they're becoming very popular. But now they're nonprofit organizations. They're not by the city-owned, but in those days, especially for immigrant children with parents who are working, provision of health services in the schools was crucial.
I think the idea of seeing the school as a center, community-centered education, is and to have an integrated delivery of services and to incorporate the community into it, and is a way of also activating the community and getting individuals to take on roles outside the family. All of these were conscious goals that Covello and other, it's really a form of progressive education, what he was doing, but it's progressive education that was made social. And it's not the individualized, to kind of glorify the child and make them into a star, It had to do really with the needs of the community, but using progressive educational techniques of actually doing, making resource maps, interviewing people in the community, creating models, and being activated. They had Benjamin Franklin High School is the only high school in the city of New York that had a garden on the roof. They had a botanical settings, which was also very Italian. It was very Southern Italian, but it also served for biology lessons and to have students have some acquaintance with growing things and so on. It's a very generous vision, a very social vision, and we've lost that, I mean, right now, Benjamin Franklin is in perfect, extraordinarily fine condition. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful building, and it's closed. It's closed. It's a pity. It's just an absolute pity. But I think in learning about Covello and Marcantonio and what they did could be very inspirational for us and absolutely applicable to so many communities that come to mind. The South Bronx comes to my mind immediately, being primarily immigrant communities with linguistic needs, with problems for the second generation, which are always specific, especially intense, where these strategies would be remarkably helpful to the students, but to the communities as a whole.
Hello?
David, does that answer your question? What else was on your mind?
No, it wasn't the question. It basically was a comment about another aspect.
Yeah,
right. But I agree with you that provision of health services also pulls in the community too. I mean,
absolutely.
Parents coming in with their children, and having the needs met and getting health advice and all this.
Can I mention, David, one thing that's on my mind is that it's interesting that so few people at the Left Forum found this to be meaningful to them. And I think we should think about that a little bit. I think that people on the left no longer imagine that cultural pluralism is a left project. That, that fighting for the preservation and retention of immigrant cultures and languages has anything to do with the left. This is so contrary to the left of the Communist Party here, for example, which fought tooth and nail for the cultural rights of immigrants, not just in their need for medical care or decent housing, but their right to their own culture, to sustain that as part of another definition of what it is to be an American. And that Anglo-Saxonizing people was a right-wing project that the left should resist. The more immigrants move away from their communities, the more right-wing they become. And it's that simple. You could map it out in East Harlem. The further you went from the center of Italian Harlem or El Barrio, the vote went down for Marcantonio. You start with the center, almost 100%. And as you went block by block by block, the more the American influence came, the more people saw their realities through a lens that was already colored for them to act in a way that wasn't in their own best interest. I mean, this is a project of the left that's been forgotten along with a great deal else. But I think that we have a responsibility to do something about it and can do something about it, I'm sure. Yes?
Just speaking to your point that the people here at the forum should be interested in education. What's happening today is the privatization. And what that does destroys the community sense of the school and all the people involved, and the board of education takes over or private a whole privatization process is a loss of that kind of feeling of community around the school. That's the argument.
But I think the privatization wins because the public schools have lost their ideology. They have no ideology. So they in fact lose. They're not fighting. They're not presenting a picture of what should be, and then not just presenting the picture, the vision. They're not presenting a vision of a public world and then implementing it through curriculum and connections with the community. So, we're not victims here. I mean, there are people on our side that aren't doing their work, aren't really ideologically and professionally and through activity. I mean, notice the connection at every point between the idea and the activity. In other words, you have the vision of the need for public housing, but then you have mechanisms like through the coalescing of community groups. By coalescing the community groups, you politicize them. That's what occurs. In other words, you take social clubs and Christian clubs and whatever else, and it's very interestingly, associations of the bodegas, for example. But by coalescing them, they almost spontaneously, they start to become politicized. They get a larger vision of what their missions are. And that can be then attached to these goals, which have successes. But our retreat, the constant retreat that we've been in for some long time now, some decades I suspect, has to do with a failure of people at in these situations to theorize what's going on and develop practical activities that can begin to materialize those ideas. That's how you win. Nobody's doing that. So we talk like we're victims. They're taking over, they're gentrifying, they're privatizing, but we are not even the beginning of a plan of how to resist that. It's pathetic, really. But they won. And I think part of it does have to do, I'm more and more convinced of this, part of this has to do with people actually living in those areas. I think you can't do it from outside. I think that people have to be there, they have to be trusted, and they have to be able to really invest themselves for term, in a way, perhaps, to turn those things around. It's not an easy thing to do, but this was a wonderful series of successes, which enabled, by the way, for pro-communist congressmen to be elected and re-elected 7 times. A whole political culture was developed,
All right, guys, everybody buy a book. We have 1,100